And I think we're back to where you started, which is we have to rethink what it means to be human. We have to realize that, and I'll quote the writer Wendell Berry here, that we live and always have lived on the human estate of grief and joy. To be fully human, to be meaningfully human, is to realize that life is defined by both grief and joy. The joy is, what we want to focus on, but the grief is inevitable.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament Podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Today we're speaking with Robert Jensen. He's Professor Emeritus of Journalism at University of Texas, Austin. Professor Jensen offers a broad and deep understanding of how various elements of our culture combine to assure gross inequality and the collapse of Earth and human systems. Professor Jensen is kind enough also to express himself a bit more personally. He speaks about his wife, Eliza Gillickson, a remarkable musician, and we will include some of her music at the end of this recording, so please listen all the way through. Hope you enjoy the profound nature of the work of Robert Jensen. So, welcome again to the Poetry of Predicament Podcast, and I'm Dean Walker, and I'm just beside myself, happy to be hosting Robert Jensen today. And for those who are regular listeners on this podcast and a number of others, it's likely that you've seen a couple of recent extensive interviews with Robert Jensen with Hambone Littletail and his podcasts. And those have been extraordinary and valuable, and I've so appreciated the area that you two have covered together. Really kind of an overview of what it is we're facing on this planet. And I'd like to cover just briefly a little bit of that same ground to just get so that folks who might be watching newly, Robert, so that they could get a sense of how you see the world out ahead of us now, and perhaps a little bit of what got us here.
Sure.
And what I was just mentioning to you before we started recording was it really piqued my interest when you both were talking about your article on the collapse of journalism and the journalism of collapse. So, I'd like to spend some time there. And we also both mentioned some interest in exploring something you briefly mentioned about a program that seems to catch your eye in terms of preparing people for helping people augment their skills as they face collapse. And I guess what I'd like to do at the very beginning here is ask you to introduce yourself as you'd like to be known now, as you are freshly in the world of the retired.
Yeah.
So welcome, Robert Jensen. Really a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Dean. So I like to just say I'm a simple boy from the prairie trying to understand the world. I was born and raised in North Dakota, eventually stumbled into mainstream newspaper journalism and then academia. And as you pointed out, I'm just concluding about 30 years in the university system, teaching in a school of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. The teaching I've been able to do has been very exciting, not because in part I'm not constrained to speaking just about journalism. I've been able to teach in university-wide and interdisciplinary programs and explore the kind of wide-ranging interests I've had in in all the, what I would call all the forms of domination and subordination that structure the modern world. That means patriarchy, male domination of women. It means white supremacy, the racialized domination of the Europeans over most of the rest of the world. It means capitalism and that system in which the wealthy dominate. And as I've gotten older, more and more I realize that all of those systems of domination and subordination, which create such inequality and oppression within the human family, are in some sense dwarfed by the larger form of domination and subordination, that is, the human claim to have a right to literally own the world, to dominate the world. And I think there is no progressive politics, no meaningful intellectual work at this point in human history that doesn't recognize the centrality of the question, who are we in the world and where will we be if we cannot break that domination-subordination dynamic? And I think I have many teachers, many people to thank for helping me understand this. But one I always like to mention is a friend of mine, now dead, named Jim Copland, who nobody knows unless you knew him personally. But Jim was a central Minnesota farm boy turned professor turned radical activist who I was fortunate to meet 30 years ago when I first started graduate school. By then, he'd retired from university teaching and was working as a full-time activist. And Jim helped me develop this framework of understanding the central questions of our time as being about this domination-subordination dynamic. And Jim, having grown up on a farm, a kind of pre-industrial farm, he grew up on a farm in which, when he was born, his father was still putting in a crop behind a team of horses. And Jim had a different kind of connection to the land than I did. And I benefited greatly from listening to him talk about ecological crises from a political and analytical point of view, but also from that very embodied position of having been a part of the earth in a different way than me. And Jim was such a significant influence on my life that after he died, I wrote a book about him called Plain Radical. And I think it's important to recognize, as Jim helped me understand, that all of these issues are connected. The problems within the human family and the problem of the human species' relationship to the larger living world are all of this same dynamic of some group of people or people in general claiming to dominate others. And so that's the perspective I bring into this. I've been lucky in my life to be, in a sense, subsidized by the state of Texas for a long time to read, write, think about these things, and to try and stitch together this perspective. So I've been involved not only in intellectual work and teaching and writing, but also in political movements kind of across the board. But at this point, I'm coming up on 60 years old. It's hard not to want to foreground what my friend Jim called the multiple cascading ecological crises. Mm-hmm. And it's important to note the crises plural, because while there's a lot of discussion about climate change, as there should be, as the central sort of existential threat to the human presence on the planet right now, that's only one of the many crises we face. Soil erosion, the loss of biodiversity and species extinction, the acidification of the ocean. I mean, you can start making a list that's rather overwhelming. That's what he meant by the multiple and cascading crises, that we can't predict the way these crises, these results of this domination and subordination dynamic will play out. The world is not linear in that sense. And so I'm growing increasingly impatient with people, including friends of mine, who say, oh, well, we've got a handle on these crises, we'll figure them out. Human ingenuity, human creativity, the scientific project will get us where we need to go. And I think that's folly. I think that misreads history. It invests in our high energy, high technology processes, a faith that is not deserved. It's what many of us would refer to as a kind of technological fundamentalism, that when we do finally come to terms with these ecological crises, there's somehow a belief in the magic of technology that will save us. And what makes it particularly fundamentalist, that is, a belief system that's asserted with a kind of certainty that really isn't warranted, is that many of the problems we face today are the consequence of previous technologies. So instead of stepping back and saying, listen, all this cheap energy that we've invested to do work for us, which has caused so many problems, of which climate change is the most dramatic, right? Instead of stepping back from that fundamentalist faith in technology, the society seems to want to double down on technology, to double down on trying to find cheap energy. And I think many of us realize that that can't be the solution, that we have to rethink the human presence on the planet. We have to recognize that 7 billion people on this planet consuming energy the way the modern world does is simply unsustainable. And as I always like to say, unsustainable systems can't be sustained. A kind of logical truism there. And I think that's a way of summing up where we're at right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm with you absolutely. And I don't want to jump ahead too quickly because there is much in what you just said. I would I would be interested in covering just a little bit of, recapping just a little bit of what I've now heard you cover and read in your essay about the collapse of journalism and so on. I'm very interested in your perspective about how journalism represents how we actually are speaking to ourselves.
Yeah.
There's no question about the utter failure of at virtually every level of systems, governmental, media and journalism, and on and on. Religion. I'm hard pressed to find any aspect of human systems that aren't encased in failure. But I'm very interested in what you see. Not just in how journalism represents the world to us, but also how we represent it, how we represent the current state of affairs in the earth to ourselves. Yeah. And I think I was hearing it in between the words of what you were saying. I'm talking about there are aspects of a cultural addiction. Literally from George W. Bush's words, we're addicted to oil. Yeah. There's an extraordinary luxury. There's an extraordinarily addictive quality to living in the most privileged generation, these generations of humanity in these past handful of generations. And I think we have all the shadow elements of fully addicted, of an addict, and we've run amok. And I'm just very curious what you see in terms of, again, not just how journalism speaks to us and tells us the story, but also how we tell ourselves the stories. So if that communicates as a question.
Right. So I think, as you're pointing out, it's not just journalism that's failed us. The universities have failed us. The churches have failed us. The political system has failed us. And of course, the corporations have failed us. Yeah. They're designed to fail us in some sense. So what are they failing to communicate? Well, I think you're getting at the central thing, which is that, the modern lifestyle, and obviously all 7 billion people on the planet are not living this modern lifestyle. We understand that much of the world consumes far too much energy, but a significant portion of the world consumes too little energy for a minimally decent standard of living. So the disparities are well understood. But overall, again, we are, I think, addicted in a certain way is a perfectly fine term. The American novelist Wallace Stegner once referred to the things once possessed that can't be done without. And I think everybody has that experience, that when you take something for granted, when you have certain kinds of material possessions or material comforts, they become the background, they become expected, they become the norm, and they're very hard to let go of. When you live in an economy that says your status in the world, your happiness in the world is connected to constantly consuming and in fact increasing consumption as a measure of status, well, then you've got a recipe for disaster. But underneath it all, I think is just a fundamental reality of life that many people are reluctant to address, including people on the left who are my friends, who are anti-capitalist, which is that this is not just a problem of capitalism. It's a problem of the human capacity, we've gotten very good at it, to seek out energy-rich carbon. You can think about it this way. In some way, life is the search for energy-rich carbon. And we've gotten very good at it, right? And I don't know of a species that is ever had to self-regulate in the way that we are going to have to, our search for that energy-rich carbon. We are, in some sense, asking of ourselves something no other species has to do, which is step back from our ability to obtain energy. Because, of course, if we continue to extract that energy, consume that energy at the levels we are, there is no possibility of a decent long-term human future. In fact, no possibility of a human future at all, perhaps. Okay, that's what we're up against. We're not just up against bad systems. We're not just up against failed institutions. We're up against a kind of imperative of life, and that's quite a challenge. Now, we're talking about who's failed, and we can come back to why journalism has failed or why the universities have failed. But the one place you do see some sign of a moral clarity on this, I think, is in the arts. You see it in novels, you see it in film, you see it in places where artists are imagining what will happen if we don't change, some of the dystopic future. You see it in utopian fiction that tries to imagine a different world. When people ask me, well, what should I read about this? Sometimes I think the best single book anybody could read is the late Octavia Butler's book, The Parable of the Sower. It's described as a science fiction novel, although I think Octavia Butler was always much more than a genre writer. She's an incredibly talented writer, sadly gone now. But The Parable of the Sower does as good a job as any book I've ever read at articulating a very probable trajectory for the human species, especially in a society like the United States. And it's rather chilling. But it also gets at the best of us as well. The main character is a very inspiring figure, a young woman who sees clear to understand this. It's a novel that includes a group of people who understand that this change is coming, and we have to walk toward it, not run away from it. So the overall picture is grim, ecologically and socially. The institutions we've invested hope in have failed us. But there is still reason, I think, to continue this conversation for all the reasons you said at the beginning. There's going to be a human presence on the planet. We're not going to go extinct overnight. And how we understand what it means to be human, how we understand the relationship of the human to the larger living world, is going to determine to some degree whether the future is dystopian or perhaps somewhere down the line more utopian. I'm not a big believer in utopia. I don't think that's really the way to think about it. But as a stand-in term for trying to conceive of a better way of living in the world, utopia will have to do for now. Eduardo Galeano always points out that utopia is something you move toward. It's like the horizon. As you move toward it, you don't get closer. You just clarify in some sense where you're traveling. And I think that's a good way to think about it. So we know what happens if we don't change. We can imagine better ways of living in the world if we do change. And then the struggle becomes political, it becomes economic, it becomes cultural. Whatever space one feels most comfortable working in. For instance, I've worked mostly in education, a little in political organizing on the side, a little in trying to work through religion. We all move where we can, where we feel the most competent to try and make that change.
I'm curious. You mentioned your friend Jim, and that he one of the blessings he left you with was a context or a framework to be able to see where we are and where we appear to be headed. And I'm curious if either you or he have come up with a way of talking about it seems to me that there is some sort of inner shift that if we don't shift ourselves and what we carry, how we define ourselves, how we operate, the human operating system, both inside and outside, if we don't shift that fundamentally, that literally we can't get there from here. There is no future to go into if we keep operating in the same way. If I may, I'll just give you an example of kind of my version, and I believe it's somewhat applicable for Carolyn as well, consistent for her. Is I kept asking myself. Just last year, I wrote and published my first book last year, and it's about this stuff, and I called it The Impossible Conversation. And I kept asking myself, how did we get here? How did we get to this predicament place? And the answers that kept showing up were always a variant of we've disconnected. We've disconnected from our own deeper selves. We've disconnected from each other, and we've disconnected from Earth. And within that would be anything you'd like about spirit or religion or faith or soul and so on, just within those. And so what I kept coming back to once I spelled out in the first half of the book, those human structures that we've got in place that are just making our downfall happen so fast and so effectively. It looked to me like any sincere human being, once their eyes are open, would need to take on reconnecting. If they're willing to go with this notion of what got us here is our disconnection, if they were then to be able to shift their attention toward reconnection, long before they're thinking about geoengineering or solutions or structures, that without the reconnection, there really is no way to get there from here. But how does that ring for you?
I think it's absolutely on point. So when we think of connections, we can think of our connection to ourself, our ability to understand ourselves, be in our own bodies. And this is a culture, this high energy, high tech consumer culture makes that difficult. It's so easy to disconnect from yourself. I often describe this as a society that's over-medicated, over-mediated, and over-marketed. That is, if you're feeling bad, well, here's some spectacle entertainment, some mass media to numb yourself, to disconnect from yourself. Here are some drugs, whether it's over the counter or whether it's on the street or prescription. Here's shopping, right? Our whole society seems to be built to make sure that when we struggle with what it means to be human, which of course means often a sense of grief, there's a way to numb that. All right. Well, there's disconnection from each other even in intimate settings. This is somewhat of a digression, but I think relevant. My original intellectual and political work was in a feminist critique of pornography and how sexually explicit media disconnects people from each other in the most intimate spaces in our lives. We can think about how communities are built, the classic suburban community in which the connection of people organically in the way they move about the world, shopping and working, leads to this disconnected suburban existence. And then we can think about the human disconnection from nature. And I use that word advisedly. I don't like to talk about nature and people because people are, of course, part of nature. So I often say, the human and the non-human world, or humans in the larger living world. But for those of us who live in cities and suburbs, it can be very difficult to actually ground yourself in the living world. I have students who grow up in suburbs and cities who have no understanding, no regular connection to the dirt, to nature. So we're disconnected on everywhere from our most intimate, solitary, to our most global, connected to the rest of the world kinds of levels. This is a culture of disconnection. And that's only possible in an affluent and energy-rich culture, because for most of human history, that kind of disconnection simply was not feasible. And I think that's one antidote to this. So when you raise these kinds of concerns and you critique, in the modern culture, people say, well, we're happier than ever, we have more stuff than ever, everything's fine. But I think that's to mistake this particular odd little episode in human history, the fossil fuel epoch, the period of cheap consumer goods and excess energy, for the human experience, because this is a very strange time in the human species history. For virtually all of our evolutionary history, we lived in small gathering and hunting band level societies, probably in the 50 to 150 range. And in such a society, there are two quite interesting differences from today. One is you don't accumulate things. There is no material possessions being accumulated in your particular corner of the band's communal housing. And there's no sense of yourself as separate from your community. The individualism and the materialism of the contemporary American world simply didn't exist. So when people say, they look around and they see the way we live in a mass consumption modern America, and they say, well, it's just human nature to want to live this way. I always point out, no, it's exactly opposite of human nature. Human nature, if you want to use that term to describe the way we evolved without the current conceptions of material possessions and individuation. We are disconnected in such a profound way that we don't even understand how odd the way we live is for the human species.
Yeah. Just a brief aside, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are here. I get to touch in with a lot of folks who are at least partially collapse aware at some level or another. And they what I've seen is there's often a bit of a shared delusion that because we've crossed the threshold together, some number of people who share this understanding or this knowledge, that there's some kind of built-in wisdom or some kind of way that we can transcend the kind of shadow encased human operating system that we all grew up in.
Yeah.
This is a pretty shadow-laden environment that we all grew up in, and it has an awful lot to do with having everything about our relationships in every direction be transactional.
Yeah.
To be, as you were saying at the very beginning, built on a domination, on a zero-sum arrangement with regard to what's in a particular relationship for me, what will I get out of it, and so on. And all those elements of domination, of competition, of zero sum, of scarcity, and of really a lack of right relationship. There's this kind of delusion of, well, now that we have some amount of understanding that our systems are built to collapse, they're ready to go, And here we are sharing that, and we can come together and kind of nod in each other's direction and agree with one another at least.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm noticing that there's no real, I'm almost, I'm shy to even ask this question because it's so obvious, but it's so human for us to think that there's some sort of built-in wisdom if we come to this, this understanding that, well, looks like collapse is imminent. So let's come together and let's have some sort of tribe, or let's have some sort of successful organization to support one another. And what I'm seeing time and time again is all the shadow that was there in the systems, the business as usual systems up to now, are coming along with us. So I'm curious if any of that is what you, and I believe there's an organization that you're fond of and are engaged with, if any of that kind of evolving together, learning together, shifting together is applied in that organization. So
I think there are kind of two different levels that you're talking about. One is that we all grew up in society that had these domination subordination dynamics. So two of the most obvious ones in the contemporary United States are patriarchy and white supremacy, the idea of male domination and the right of white Europeans to rule. Okay. Well, people on the left, that is people with a critique of capitalism or US imperialism, and I've been part of those kind of movements, have had to painfully recognize that just because we have articulated a critique of capitalism or of US and European domination of the world, it doesn't mean we're free of these other domination subordination dynamics. And the problems are quite painful as we try to work through them. And on the left, I think it's not perfect, but there's an increasing understanding that we all do carry those shadows, as you're calling them. And that's important to keep struggling. And from those small, lessons, we realize that it's not an easy road. None of us are going to magically transcend the culture in which we were raised. I think there's another level you're talking about too, which is a kind of belief that somehow we are destined to solve this problem. And I think the kind of shorthand way of challenging that is just to say, well, what if the human with the big brain, us, Homo sapiens, what if we're an evolutionary dead end? What if, in fact, the cognitive powers that we have, which have allowed us to so thoroughly sort of understand the workings of the material world and exploit that understanding to our at least short-term material benefit, what if that is simply the path to an extinction? And again, not in the sense that every human will die in the world, but that human domination of the world will pass as the domination of other species has. There's no guarantee that we individually are going to transcend the culture we're part of, and there's no reason to believe that we're going to collectively transcend the fate that has befallen other species. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the problem with all of that. That doesn't lead to a kind of happy conclusion. And in a culture that is always trying to sell us a happy ending, a lot of people instinctively resist this. And I think we're back to where you started, which is we have to rethink what it means to be human. We have to realize that, and I'll quote the writer Wendell Berry here, that we live and always have lived on the human estate of grief and joy. To be fully human, to be meaningfully human, is to realize that life is defined by both grief and joy. The joy is, what we want to focus on, but the grief is inevitable. And that reckoning with the grief of the world right now is a reckoning that we're talking about. We're using the term collapse, and I think most people understand that's shorthand for a series of material realities and processes that are only going to end one way. It doesn't mean, that we're going to wake up one day and it's like a science fiction movie where everything collapses around us. in some sense, we are in a process of collapse. In the more vulnerable parts of the world, that's being experienced quite dramatically. Christian Parenti, in his book, The Tropic of Chaos, talks about the band in the world, which has, not surprisingly, also suffered the most from European and American colonialism and is experiencing the effects of climate change most dramatically. These are already realities. You look at the low-lying areas, look at Bangladesh. This is already a place where collapse is unfolding. But when we say collapse, I think what we mean is recognizing this process at some point is going to reach even the most insulated and wealthy parts of the world. That those of us living in the first world, in American cities with all of the accoutrements of modern industrial society, eventually are going to face this as well. And we don't know if that's going to be in 10 years or 100 years. There's no way to make predictions, but it is in fact I think the only future that's out there for us. And to come up against that, especially when you come out of a culture that has tried to guarantee you never even think about this, let alone process it emotionally, it's a real wake-up call. It is literally like getting hit with a 2x4 upside the head. I see it in students all the time, because students, unlike folks at a dinner party, can't escape me. So if you're in a social situation, you start talking about this, you can watch people head for the exits or, slip off to the bathroom and make sure they never see you again for the rest of the party. But students are forced to spend 15 weeks with me. And I try to address these in ways that are both honest yet compassionate. And I can see in my students this awareness that, yes, the way I'm describing the world is accurate. And it's a way they've always sort of intuitively known, but were never able to articulate. When they did try to articulate it, they were often shut down by adults or peers. And that over the course of those 15 weeks, one can create a space in which you try to deal with it. But for most people, that space simply doesn't exist. So we're back to this question again of how do we create those spaces in which we can all process them, because none of us are going to wake up and understand this and magically make the changes in our life we have to do and create the political movements to make those changes into policy. Right now, we're still struggling to tell the story, and we're still struggling to create the spaces in which we can share that story. This podcast is one of them. The kind of art that I was talking about, novels and films, are one of those spaces. But that space has to be expanded dramatically if there's going to be any hope of a decent human future. And the culture is trying to shut it down. And that's, where the struggle is in some sense right now, to create the space and tell the story.
Got it. It sounds like there's an awful lot of overlap with your orientation to all of this and where Carolyn and I are going. I know that both Carolyn and I have a huge appreciation for the work of Francis Weller, as he talks about various aspects of grief and an orientation toward grief. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if that is a part of that extraordinary opportunity that you've had to be with students for, I think you said 15 weeks at a time. Have you seen them muster any intention to really integrate skills of, or an apprenticeship with grief in their life? Does it become more of an active part of who they are, their awareness of grief and their integration of grief in that time?
Yeah. Let's say, you can assess any situation by breaking it into thirds. Okay. The rule of thirds. Every situation can be analyzed in thirds. So I would say that of the students I've interacted with more recently, a third of them are dead set against any acknowledgement that the conversation we're having is meaningful. Frankly, I think they're out of reach, at least in the short term. They are so committed to a framework of understanding the world that says, everything's going to be fine. I'm going to get an education. I'm going to maximize my own, economic and social status, and everything's going to be fine. I don't really know what to say to those kids. I think in some sense, if there is a wake-up call, it's down the line. Okay? On the other hand, a third of the students come in probably not with a fully formed framework of analysis, but with some recognition that the story they've been told their whole life, in high school, by their parents, in church, wherever it was, but that story simply is a deception. It's an illusion. It's an attempt to paper over real problems. And they're hungry for a story that makes sense. And in some sense, those are the students ready to face that grieving because they've been engaged in it at some level that they might not have been able to articulate. And those students are ready to grasp both the intellectual and the emotional work necessary to move forward. Then there's a third in the middle that I think come to our universities with no political or moral commitments at all. They're just floating in a society, a consumer society, most of them middle-class kids who've never had to reflect on any of these things and hence never have. And those are the students, in some sense, I'm most interested in. How many of those will kind of wake up? Whether they adopt my perspective on the world or not, I'm not concerned about. I'm more concerned that they realize there is a world out there that they have a connection to, a moral responsibility in. And that's the way it looks to me after 26 years of full-time teaching at the University of Texas. And it's a reminder that, one has to have reasonable expectations. If you go into the classroom thinking you're going to, take every student to this new level, it's not a very realistic expectation. So I try to present this material in ways that isn't laden with jargon. It's understandable. It's straightforward. It's empirically grounded in that we pay attention to the science that tells us about the state of the world, that tries to think about the systems, that is, systems like capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy, out of which this problem arises, right? This domination-subordination dynamic, and then tries to be emotionally sensitive to the fact that we all have to live meaningful lives. We all search for ways to have, a sense of joy in the world, so that it's not a relentless sort of doomsday preaching. And I think that's what, the struggle is right now, to be empirically grounded and politically coherent and emotionally aware of how nobody's got answers, nobody's got solutions. We're all struggling together to try and understand this. And it's going to be difficult along the way. We're going to run into our own limitations, that is individual failures, and we're going to run into the limitations of the species, especially given how much water is going through the turbines and what the limits are right now about our ecosystem's capacities to regenerate after the damage we've done. And in some sense, that's not a happy story, of course. But in some sense, I think when people who've been struggling to articulate this, when they finally hear somebody else articulate it, there's a sense of relief. So a lot of people tell me, well, I kind of believe the same thing you do, but I don't want to be a downer. And I reject that. I don't think it's a downer to say what is in so many of our hearts and minds. In fact, it's not a downer at all. When you are struggling by yourself with something this overwhelming, it's paralyzing. The minute you realize other people are analyzing the world in the same way and reacting emotionally in the same way, then all of a sudden there's some hope because you realize you're not alone. So I think it's more important than ever to articulate as bluntly as possible the kinds of analyses we're talking about, because other people are thinking them even if they're not yet articulating them.
Mm-hmm. I got it. Would this be a good time to shift gears to, I've just been so curious since your mention in another interview about a program that has your interest, and I don't remember much about it. I just remember thinking that sounds very similar to some stuff that Carolyn and I are working on. So if
Sure.
you would, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, the program is called Ecosphere Studies, not the most elegant name, but it's a project coming out of the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. And a lot of people aren't familiar with it unless they're active in the sustainable agriculture movement. The Land Institute was formed about 42 years ago to work on an alternative to the industrial ag system, and in a sense, an alternative to the industrial university system. It was co-founded by Wes and Dana Jackson, and it had both an education outreach cultural component and a scientific agricultural component. The research end of it has sort of dominated, especially in the work on trying to breed perennial grain crops. So without getting too technical, most of our agriculture today is, of course, annual plants, corn, soybeans, all those are annuals, which mean plowing, which means soil erosion. And Wes Jackson, who's a Kansas farm boy turned geneticist and professor, asked the question, what would it be to develop perennial grains? Rice, wheat, corn, the main grains that human beings eat. Wes pointed out that there's a lot of thought going into gardening and community-supported agriculture and organic vegetables and those sorts of things. But we need to deal with this question of grains because about 70% of human calories come from grains. And about 70% of our tillable acres are planted in grains. And Wes has been thinking for a long time about what it would mean to develop perennial grains. And it's been an exciting project. The first of those grains, an intermediate wheatgrass, is now in limited commercial production. As I said, they're also working on perennial rice, perennial sorghum, perennial lentils, perennial sunflower variety. It's really very exciting work. But as the research end of the Land Institute took off, the education and outreach, the cultural component, kind of got sidetracked. So Wes, after retiring from running the organization full time, has launched this Ecosphere Studies program to try and help us rethink the way we understand human beings in the world. And it's not unique, as you point out. It resonates with your own thinking. It resonates with lots of other approaches to what some people would call a kind of deep ecology. It resonates with certain traditional and indigenous systems that have always understood the human relationship to the world differently. In this case, it's growing out of a successful perennial project. So we're thinking of it as kind of perennial education for the long term, education that doesn't adopt the industrial values. And it's a program very much in its infancy. We've been trying to sketch this for the last couple of years. We're now starting to go out and do workshops that are both educational in the traditional sense, but also experiential, that draw on the science that the Land Institute has been developing, but also recognize the role of the arts, that there is no way to move forward in our understanding of our place in the world without that artistic and spiritual component. It's a grand experiment at the moment, and it's exciting. Again, not because it promises some great solution to all the problems, not because it's a unique and completely new way of approaching the world, but growing out of a project that for 40 years has been successful, thinking about agriculture. We want to branch out now with more of an education and outreach program. And one of the most important and enjoyable parts of it is, as we've been meeting to try and sketch this, it's been truly interdisciplinary. There are a few ecologists and soil scientists in the group, but there are people from fine arts, people from the social sciences, anthropologists, philosophers. The program is co-directed by a literature scholar and a philosopher. Wes comes out of genetics and agronomy. And I think that's another thing we have to realize, that trying to solve problems within disciplinary boundaries that come with the modern university is a failed project. The hyper-specialization of the modern university is working against us at this point. And so this is an educational project that tries to transcend educational disciplinary boundaries. Wes always says we have to feature questions that go beyond the available answers. We have to ask questions that we don't know the answer to, and we have to move beyond the boundaries that have defined, not only the modern university, but the intellectual project more generally. People will say, well, I'm a chemist, or, I'm an anthropologist. And by saying that, sometimes they say, don't ask me anything beyond my specialty. Well, unfortunately, the world doesn't operate in specialties. The world operates as an integrated whole, right? And it has to be understood that way. And that's where we run up against kind of the paradox is the modern scientific project has been so successful by examining the world in its component parts. This is what we call reductionism in science. Scientists don't study the universe, they study little parts of it. And that has allowed us to really deepen our understanding of matter and energy and the way the world works. But it's also destroyed the integrity of systems and led us to believe that we can manipulate complex systems through these disciplinary innovations. And that has been a failure. And so how do you retain the best of what we've learned through science, recognize the need for integration and a more holistic system of understanding it, and go forward without driving yourself crazy? That's the project.
I got it. Every time you've said the word about including the arts, the word that always comes forward for me first is poetry.
Yeah.
And particularly when we also talk about the notion of grief, it makes a really permeable edge between these supposedly very different aspects of being human beings on the planet, all the systems and the linear and so on, and then that which is far more spacious, that which is far more mysterious, that which has gotten so little of our attention for so long. And I'm curious if one thing I can tell you in my experience of diving deeply into this exploration of collapse of human and earth systems and who will we be together in the face of it all. One thing that helps me find a center, even when things are really stressed, is to remember what I most love, what matters most to me in life, and pretty consistently since I was a child, that's been the ocean.
Yeah,
my particular grounding place, and it's there that it is my most consistent access to grief, is through that particular gateway. And I'm curious if you would share with us if you have particular ways that you keep your heart open, ways that you keep that membrane between the layers of humanity more porous, how you keep your relationship with others and with Earth.
Yeah.
How you keep that open.
Well, as you were speaking, I was actually not thinking about myself, but thinking about my partner, my wife, who's a musician, a singer-songwriter named Eliza Gilkison. And her work has always been around these themes, going back to when she was a teenager in the 70s. But especially her more recent work, her records of late, including the one that's about to come out, really deal with this. In fact, she's got a CD coming out in July called Secularia that every song on it is hitting at exactly what you're talking about. And I was thinking of her reaction when we go to New Mexico. So we live in Austin, Texas, but she spent a lot of time in New Mexico over the years. And she, I think, literally becomes a different person in the mountains. For her, for you, it's the oceans. For her, it's the mountains. Mm-hmm. And it opens up a certain joy in her and a certain grief as well. And I've watched that and been moved by it. And it helps me recognize that I grew up in a very different way and don't have a grounding place. I'm from the prairie. I was born and raised in North Dakota, and there's something evocative about the prairie for me, but I don't have the same relationship to it. And that's a result of a particular set of experiences I had growing up. It's, we all come into this in different ways. And so for me, it's the absence of such a place that weighs on me, and the recognition that in some ways I'm more typical than you are. That there are more of us out here who don't have that grounding place. And every generation, that's more common. And that was another thing that was so powerful in my relationship with Jim Coplin, who was 25 years older than me and was so organically connected to the Minnesota farm country that he grew up in. And we talked often about the absence of that experience for me and how it made me a different person. And that was a source, again, of grief and joy. So for some of us, it's about connecting to something that has been central in our lives. For some of us, it's about creating connections that didn't exist. And in both senses, there's grief. There's grief in me for recognizing that I grew up so utterly disconnected from the world that it was not until I was an adult that I recognized the degree of that disconnection. For others, it's more a longing for what once was present and now maybe is not so present. But it all gets us to this same place, this sense of grief and joy. And we were talking about poetry earlier, and this is where I often kind of come to rest. It's 3 lines from my favorite Wendell Berry poem. The poem is called How to Be a Poet, although I always tell students when I read them this poem that it can be read as How to Be a Human Being. But in the poem of Wendell Berry's How to Be a Poet, there are 3 lines that the first time I read them chilled me every time I read or say them aloud. And in the middle of that poem, he reminds us, he says, there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. And he reminds us that all the world is sacred. Either all of this planet is sacred or none of it is, right? It's not that there are, human spaces like churches and temples and mosques that are sacred. Or for some people, the pristine mountains are sacred. The streets of the South Bronx are sacred, right? The parking lot of the mall is sacred. Either it's all sacred or none of it is. And if we divvy up the world between the sacred and the unsacred, we're missing the point. There are sacred places, and then there are those places we have desecrated. And I think that's the kind of painful reckoning that we have to come to, that we have in fact desecrated part of creation. And I use the word creation even though I don't believe in a creator. I don't have a standard theology about God. But I've always liked the word creation to describe this larger living world because it reminds us that none of us know how this came to be. We are in a world that we cannot fathom the origins of, that we were given something quite beautiful and mysterious, and we have in fact desecrated much of it. And that should be a moral imperative to reverse that, to recognize the sacred nature of all the world, just as we recognize, or at least should recognize, the sacred nature of all people. That there's something in life that needs to be respected. And the systems of politics and economics and society that we've created have led to a routine disrespect for and desecration of not only each other, but that larger living world. And those 2 struggles, the struggle for social justice and the struggle for ecological sustainability, are not separable. They're of a kind. Because as you keep saying, they're about whether or not we are in right relation to each other in that larger living world or out of that relation. And whether one comes to that through traditional theology, through spirituality, through science, through art, whatever it is, I think that is what the common core of people who are struggling is, to recognize that we are out of right relation, and that is the central human struggle, to find that way back. Mm-hmm. And people will do it in different ways with different language. But when we see that in each other, I think we resonate to each other. And again, that's where whatever one wants to call hope, that's what I think, that's where the hope lies.
Can I hold on to you for just a couple extra minutes?
Sure.
So everything that you just laid out, the center of it, of what I heard, was that we have desecrated, and I honor that works. And I have a question for you. It's been ever since I had a couple folks give me some coaching on writing my book, and thank goodness they did. The first draft, they basically said, go back and write it again. Nobody will read this one. So I did all that. And in the second and hopefully better version of the book, I got to include the presidency of Donald Trump and the lead up to it and so on. And the words that have come to the fore that weren't included in the first round of the book were contempt and violence. And yes, I would say just about everything you just said about desecration and the sacred and their relationship and our dynamic within them. But I'm wondering how much those words, those concepts of contempt and violence have shown up as you've educated the students in your classes, as you've shared what you see about the world in your classes. I'm having a hard time not landing on contempt and violence as our modus operandi, as a human operating system, which I believe it just lands for me much more boldly and resolutely than desecration. Have those shown up for you at all? And does that communicate anything with you?
Yeah. And I think there are multiple languages into similar conclusions, but let's recognize that the affluence of the first world, much of the rest of the world now, is based on exploitation. It's the exploitation of the human beings and the exploitation of the larger living world. And there's something, I think, about exploitation that doesn't sit well with us. There's a kind of deep ethical norm in human communities that helps us recognize that exploitation is not consistent with the kind of beings we claim to want to be.
Yeah.
And you cannot engage in that exploitation for very long without developing a rationalization for it. And one of the most common ways is contempt for that which one is exploiting. When we do it with human beings, we dehumanize people. The extreme example is slavery, in which you turn a human being into simply a piece of machinery, in a sense. The ultimate dehumanization. When men buy and sell women in prostitution, it's dehumanizing, a complete complex human subject into an object. Whenever there is routine exploitation, there is contempt, because you cannot use another person without developing a rationalization, and usually that's about your own superiority, and that leads to contempt for that which is allegedly inferior. And that also then masks the violence that's required for the exploitation to continue. And what's true of our relationships with each other is also true of the way we exploit the world. The world isn't living. The other creatures of the world don't have status. If we're going to exploit them, we have to develop a kind of contempt for them, with a subset of those that we treat as pets. So all living things can be used except Fido. which has sort of pseudo-human status. Yes, okay. That contempt for the non-living world, right? It's just dirt. It's just rocks. It doesn't matter. There's an incredible violence, of course, in the way we extract resources from the world. I think you're right that a world based on exploitation is going to normalize contempt and violence. And in fact, that's what we've seen for centuries now in the world we built. And there's a violation of the sanctity of the living in that. You can call it a desecration. You can, again, use secular or theological language. You can use artistic or scientific language. The fact is that we have created a world that none of us can morally embrace. That to morally embrace the world around us is to surrender part of your own humanity. And maybe Donald Trump is simply the kind of caricatured embodiment of that. The most intense expression of it. And I think it's, of course, important to oppose Trump, to oppose the policies, but also to recognize that, this is not a world created by Donald Trump. It's a world that created him. And we're all implicated in that and all part of it. And so I think there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to do politically in the short term in this moment in history. But there's also a lot to learn about who we are, what our systems and institutions produce, and need to come to terms with that at a level much beyond the current administration.
Indeed. Well, Robert Jensen, it just feels like a wonderful blessing to have been able to spend time with you, to meet you. I so appreciate the work that you've been doing for so long. If it would be possible to, at some point in the not too distant future, to spend some more time with you, I'd sure love that. I noticed that we really didn't get to spend much time at all in the area of journalism, and I have a huge interest in that, and would love to just ask you to share at length about that. So hopefully that is a possibility.
Absolutely.
And I wish you well. I wish you abundant peace and joy and fulfillment in whatever you fill your time with in your newly retired state. And thanks again so much for talking with me and with us today.
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me on, Dean. It was great.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Down here on the corner of ruin and grace, I'm growing weary of the human race. Hold my lamp up in everyone's face, looking for an honest man. Everyone tied to the turning wheel, everyone hiding from the things they feel. Oh, the truth's so hard, it just don't seem real. The shadow across this land. People around here don't know what it means to suffer at the hands of our American dreams. Turn their backs on the grisly scenes, traced to the privileged sons. They got their God, they got their guns, got their armies and the chosen ones. But we'll all be burning in the same big sun when the great correction comes. Down through the ages, lovers of the mystery, you've been saying, people, let your love light shine. Poets and sages all throughout history that we gotta get through, but the end could be the start of something new when the great correction comes. Lovers of the mystery, they've been saying, people, let your love light shine. Poets and sages all throughout history, they say the light burns brightest in the darkest time. Got hope in this heart of mine, but the future waits on the horizon line for our daughters and our sons. I don't know where this train's bound, a whole lot of people trying to turn it around. Gonna shout till the walls come tumbling down and the great correction. Me down when the great correction comes.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. You may want to check out our sister podcasts, the New Lifeboat Hour with Carolyn Baker on Podbean and at carolynbaker.net. Also, the Impossible Conversation podcast, another channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. Join us again later for another episode of the Poetry of Predicament.